Here's what the German High Command never understood about occupation. When you force a linguist to translate your military orders, you're not just hiring a clerk, you're giving him the power to decide what you actually said. And Stanisław Wieczorek understood something they didn't, that the most devastating sabotage doesn't announce itself. It just quietly rewrites reality, one word at a time. In the spring of 1943, inside a cramped administrative office on the third floor of Warsaw's repurposed State Archive building, a man named Stanisław Wieczorek sat perfectly still at a wooden desk scarred with cigarette burns, his fountain pen poised above a sheet of Wehrmacht correspondence paper. Outside the smudged window beyond the typewriters and filing cabinets, German soldiers stood guard at checkpoints where papers were demanded and lives ended for a missing stamp. The room smelled of carbon paper and stale tobacco, the same bureaucratic scent that had saturated every occupation office across Europe. But in this particular room, something was different. The Nazis had transformed Warsaw into a machine of control, every order documented, every movement authorized, every command flowing through translators who converted German precision into Polish compliance. Yet somehow, impossibly, Wieczorek had become the one person these officers trusted completely to render their words into official record, to transform their verbal commands into written directives that would move battalions and reshape battle lines. They had no idea they were dictating orders to a man who had already decided to destroy them. Not with explosives, but with something far more insidious, something they would never detect until it had already fractured their entire command structure from within. Wieczorek was not a soldier, not a spy, not even a member of the Polish resistance in any official capacity. Before the war, he had been exactly what he appeared to be, a university linguist who specialized in German legal texts, parsed medieval manuscripts, and gave lectures to rooms of bored students who would never use his knowledge of dialectical variations in High German. He was 38 years old, thin-framed, with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slid down his nose and hands, so steady they never trembled, even when he wrote words that would condemn men to confusion and death. And he had an elderly mother and a younger sister who depended on him to stay invisible, to keep his head down, to survive. But Wieczorek had also been trained in something the Germans never considered dangerous, the architecture of language itself. He understood that words were not stable containers of meaning, but fluid, contextual, capable of shifting between interpretations based on syntax, precedent, and the assumptions of the reader. He knew that German, efficient, precise, engineered German, contained hairline fractures in its vocabulary where a single term could mean two opposite things depending on how it was framed. And he understood that bureaucracies, especially military bureaucracies, treated written language as gospel, as truth more binding than the spoken word. What began as speech became documentation. Documentation became orders. Orders became reality. What the German officers did not know, what they could not have known, was that Wieczorek had been conducting an experiment, a calculated, desperate experiment born from equal parts linguistic genius and cold, patient fury. 6 months earlier, he had begun testing the boundaries of translation accuracy, discovering which phrasings could survive scrutiny, which ambiguities were defensible, which alternate meanings existed within established military doctrine. He had no collaborators, no network, no backup plan, just his expertise, his access, and a growing understanding that he occupied a position of invisible power. The man who turned speech into text was the man who decided what had actually been said. The technique was almost elegant in its precision. Wieczorek would translate his German clients exactly as they expected, with professionalism, deference, perfect grammatical form. But certain words, carefully selected words that existed in gray zones of interpretation, would be rendered not as the speaker intended, but as the language technically permitted. A directive to secure a position could be documented as eliminate it, both legitimate translations of bereinigen. An order to clarify a supply route could become restrict it, clarin, permitted both. No forgery, no fabrication, just the exploitation of linguistic ambiguity that German doctrine had never imagined could be weaponized. The translation would be technically correct, legally defensible, and strategically catastrophic. And by the time anyone questioned the wording, the orders would already be executed, the units already moved, the damage already irreversible. Now, before we dive into how Wieczorek executed his plan, I need you to consider something. This man had no army, no weapons, no escape route, just a fountain pen, a gift for languages, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, the courage to sit across from men who could execute him on a whim and calmly, methodically dismantle their entire operation using the very precision they prided themselves on. If you admire that kind of quiet, brilliant defiance, if you believe that ordinary people with extraordinary knowledge can change history without ever firing a shot, then show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel. Every like, every subscription tells us you want more stories like this. Stories of intellectuals who became warriors, of scholars who weaponized their expertise, of invisible resistance that left no monuments but changed everything. Because heroes don't always carry rifles. Sometimes they just carry dictionaries. And sometimes that's enough. This quiet act of linguistic warfare did not begin with Wieczorek's first mistranslation. It began years earlier, in the lecture halls of Warsaw University, where a gifted but unremarkable scholar had trained himself to see language not as communication, but as architecture, fragile, beautiful, and capable of catastrophic collapse if you knew exactly where to apply pressure. Before the war, Stanisław Wieczorek had been the kind of academic who disappeared into footnotes. He specialized in German legal texts from the 17th century, parsing judicial opinions that most scholars found too tedious to examine. He translated land disputes, inheritance contracts, and bureaucratic correspondence that had been gathering dust in Prussian archives for 200 years. His colleagues found this work soul-crushing. Wieczorek found it revelatory. Because legal language, he discovered, was built on a foundation of controlled ambiguity. Words deliberately chosen to permit multiple interpretations depending on who held power when the document was enforced. He had never been political. He voted occasionally, attended faculty meetings reluctantly, and believed sincerely that precision in translation was a moral duty, not a tool for manipulation. Words, he taught his students, should clarify, not obscure. A translator's job was to disappear, to become a transparent medium through which meaning passed unchanged from one language to another. Then the Germans came, and they decided he was useful. The conscription wasn't violent, no rifle pressed to his back, no threats shouted in his face. Just a letter delivered by a Wehrmacht courier, stamped with official seals, informing him that his linguistic expertise had been requisitioned for administrative purposes in service of the occupation authority. Report to the State Archive Building. Bring credentials. Failure to comply would result in consequences for immediate family members. The threat was surgical, bureaucratic, and absolute. so Wieczorek reported, and within a week he understood the twisted logic of his position. The Germans needed translators because they needed documentation. Every order, every requisition, every execution had to be recorded in both German and Polish, proof of legality, proof of process, proof that the occupation followed rules, even as it devoured the city. Translators made atrocity look administrative. He worked alongside others pressed into the same service. There was Oberleutnant Richter, a junior officer so obsessed with procedural correctness that he would spend 30 minutes debating whether forthwith or immediately better conveyed the urgency of a supply requisition. And there was Piotr Kaminski, an older Polish clerk who had worked in the building before the war, who now kept his eyes fixed on his typewriter and spoke only when directly addressed, as if invisibility could be achieved through sheer force of silence. Wieczorek watched them both and learned the unspoken rule of survival. Translators were conduits, not actors. You processed words the way a pipe processes water, neutrally, mechanically, without contaminating the flow. The Germans trusted you precisely because you had no agency, no capacity for independent thought. You were a function, not a person. And for 6 months, Wieczorek played that role flawlessly. But late at night, alone in his small apartment with blackout curtains drawn, he would sit at his desk, reviewing the military dictionaries the Germans had provided, standard references for technical terminology, tactical phrases, operational language. He began noticing something the Germans had never considered. Words outlast the men who speak them. Documents outlive intentions. And in the space between what was said and what was written, there existed a gap wide enough to hide a war. Language, he realized, was the only weapon the Germans had given him. He just had to learn which words could kill. The word appeared in a routine directive dated April 14, 1943, issued by Oberst Heinrich Vogel, regarding partisan activity in the Praga district. Die östlichen Zufahrtswege sind bis Freitag zu bereinigen. In German military doctrine, bereinigen carried weight. It appeared in operational manuals, in tactical assessments, in after-action reports. Depending on context, it could mean to secure, to clear, to sanitize, to resolve, to eliminate, or to administratively finalize. The ambiguity wasn't accidental. It was structural, built into the language to allow commanders flexibility in execution while maintaining plausible deniability in documentation. Wieczorek had been studying this word for 3 weeks. He knew that in 18th century Prussian legal texts, bereinigen meant to settle a dispute without assigning fault. In 19th century military correspondence, it evolved to mean clearing an area of obstacles, trees, debris, civilian presence. By 1943, Wehrmacht doctrine used it interchangeably. Secure a route could mean establish checkpoints, or it could mean evacuate all inhabitants. The language permitted both. The language required both to be possible. When Oberst Vogel dictated the order that morning, standing at the window, cigarette in hand, not bothering to look at Wieczorek, he meant secure. Establish patrols, increase surveillance, standard occupation procedure. Wieczorek wrote, eliminate, not vernichten, which would have been obvious, suspicious, unmistakably violent. Just bereinigen, rendered into Polish as zlikwidować, to liquidate, to remove entirely. A legitimate translation, defensible in any military dictionary, supported by historical precedent in German Eastern Front operations. He made the choice in 4 seconds. His hand didn't shake. His expression didn't change. When he handed the translated document to Oberleutnant Richter for verification, the junior officer scanned it with his usual pedantic precision, comparing phrases, checking terminology against the standard reference materials stacked on his desk. He found nothing irregular. Bereinigen could indeed be rendered as WWII in tactical contexts. The translation was accurate. Richter initialed the document. Vogel signed it without reading the Polish text. He never did. The directive was copied, stamped, and distributed to battalion commanders responsible for the eastern approach roads by 2 p.m. Outside, through the ice-streaked window, Wieczorek could see soldiers assembling in the courtyard. Young men in greatcoats stomping their boots against the cold, breath steaming in the April chill, waiting for orders that would tell them what Bereinigen meant today. They would receive the directive by courier within the hour. They would read it. They would execute it. And somewhere in that chain of command, someone would have to decide. Did the Oberst mean secure or eliminate? Did he want patrols or evacuations, checkpoints or clearances? The order didn't say, because the language didn't require it to say. That was the beauty of bureaucratic ambiguity. It protected superiors by forcing subordinates to interpret, to guess, to take responsibility for choices that commanders never explicitly made. Wieczorek had simply selected an interpretation, one that would require clarification, one that would spark questions, one that would introduce hesitation into a system built on certainty. No lies told, no facts altered. Just language doing what language always does, meaning different things to different people at different moments. By 4 o'clock that evening, the translated orders had reached every unit commander in the eastern sector. And in a field headquarters 6 kilometers from the Vistula, Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner sat at a folding table, directive in hand, and read the line 3 times. Then he stopped, and frowned, and reached for his radio. 3 days later, the reports began arriving. First Company, tasked with securing the northern checkpoint, had delayed deployment for 9 hours, waiting for clarification on evacuation protocols that were never issued. Second Company, interpreting the order as full area clearance, had redirected supply trucks intended for the eastern garrison, sending them instead to temporary holding facilities that didn't exist. By the time the confusion was identified, fuel reserves were critically low, and a scheduled reconnaissance patrol had been postponed indefinitely. On April 19th, a Wehrmacht unit operating near Remberthof arrived 6 hours behind schedule to reinforce a position already abandoned due to partisan pressure. 4 soldiers were killed in the resulting ambush. Not a catastrophic loss, just enough to require explanation, documentation, blame. The briefing room on the 3rd floor, which had always hummed with efficient German certainty, began to sound different. Conversations that once moved with military crispness now hesitated, doubled back, required repetition. Officers who had previously issued commands with absolute confidence now paused mid-sentence, asking for verbal confirmation of written orders, demanding secondary verification of translated directives. Oberst Vogel convened a meeting on April 21st. Wieczorek sat in his usual corner, notepad ready, fountain pen poised. The Oberst's voice, normally clipped and authoritative, carried an unfamiliar edge, not anger exactly, but something closer to confusion hardening into suspicion. The eastern routes were to be secured, not evacuated, not cleared of all personnel, secured. Hauptmann Steiner, standing with his cap under his arm, replied carefully. The directive specified WWII, Herr Oberst. Given the partisan activity reports, we interpreted. I did not authorize evacuation. The written order, I know what I authorized. The room went silent. Not the silence of respect, but the silence of men realizing that language had betrayed them, that somewhere between speech and documentation, meaning had fractured. Wieczorek kept his eyes on his notepad. His pen moved steadily, recording the exchange with perfect accuracy. He could feel the tension in the room pressing against him like a physical weight, the realization spreading through the command structure that orders, once written, became immutable. That what was documented superseded what was intended, that the machinery of bureaucracy, which they had trusted absolutely, contained a flaw they had never considered. It required translators. Oberleutnant Richter cleared his throat. Herr Oberst, perhaps we should review the translation protocols, ensure terminological consistency across— Vogel cut him off. Who translated this directive? The question hung in the air. Wieczorek felt every eye in the room turn toward his corner. Wieczorek looked up from his notepad, meeting Vogel's gaze with the practiced neutrality he had perfected over 6 months of invisibility. I did, Herr Oberst. And the term zlikvidowach, this was your choice. It is the standard rendering of bereinigen in tactical contexts, Herr Oberst. Wehrmacht Terminology Reference Manual, Section 4.7, subsection on area operations. I can provide the citation if— That won't be necessary. Vogel's jaw tightened. He looked at the directive again, as if the paper itself might confess to treachery. But there was nothing to find. The translation was correct. Technically, legally, defensively correct. And that was precisely the problem. Within a week, the entire administrative apparatus began to calcify. Every directive now required written addendums clarifying intent. Verbal orders, which had once moved with the speed of command authority, were now followed by immediate requests for documentation. Confirm in writing became the most common phrase in the State Archive building, repeated so frequently it lost all meaning beyond self-protection. Meetings that had previously lasted 30 minutes now stretched to 2 hours. Officers who had once issued commands with Prussian efficiency now spent half their time drafting supplementary memoranda explaining what their original orders had meant. Wieczorek's workload tripled. Every translation was now reviewed twice, sometimes 3 times, with Oberleutnant Richter cross-referencing terminology against multiple dictionaries, legal precedents, and previous operational documents. But here was the bitter irony that Wieczorek understood, and the Germans could not. The more they scrutinized his work, the more they relied on him. Because precision, it turned out, was its own form of protection. Each translation he provided was flawless, grammatically perfect, terminologically defensible, supported by documentation. When challenged, he would calmly cite sources, provide historical context, demonstrate that every choice he made existed within the boundaries of acceptable linguistic practice. He became indispensable precisely because he was impeccable. The system began consuming itself. Major Klaus Dienst, responsible for supply chain coordination, spent an entire morning arguing with Hauptmann Steiner about whether umleiten, to redirect, implied temporary rerouting or permanent reassignment. Neither would approve the order until a legal liaison could be consulted. The supplies sat in a warehouse for 4 days. Junior officers stopped trusting their own judgment. Every directive was escalated, every interpretation questioned, every decision deferred upward until the chain of command resembled not a hierarchy but a gridlock. Dozens of competent men paralyzed by the fear that language itself had become unreliable. And the Germans, with their devotion to process and protocol, could not simply abandon documentation. They could not return to verbal orders alone, because verbal orders left no proof, no accountability, no legal framework for occupation. The machine required paperwork. Paperwork required translation. Translation required Wieczorek, In officers' mess halls and secure briefing rooms, the conversations shifted. No one accused the translator. He was too careful, too correct, too thoroughly documented. Instead, they blamed the doctrine itself. The terminology was insufficient. The manuals were outdated. The linguistic standards were imprecise. Somewhere in the architecture of German military language, there existed a structural weakness that allowed meaning to slip sideways between intention and execution. They were right, of course. They just didn't realize the weakness was being exploited. On May 3rd, Oberst Vogel received a coded communiqué from Regional Command. Wieczorek never saw the document. It was marked for German eyes only, but he noticed the change immediately. Vogel's interactions became colder, more formal. Oberleutnant Richter began attending meetings he had previously skipped, and twice Wieczorek caught unfamiliar officers observing him from the doorway. Men in civilian clothes who took notes and asked no questions. The investigation had begun, quietly, carefully, without announcement or accusation. They were looking for sabotage, but they didn't know what sabotage looked like when it was hidden inside perfect grammar. The Gestapo arrived on May 7th, 3 men in long coats who moved through the State Archive building like smoke. Silent, pervasive, leaving a residue of fear wherever they passed. They set up operations in a basement room that had previously stored requisition forms, and within hours, the building's entire rhythm changed. Typewriters fell silent mid-sentence. Conversations dropped to whispers. Even Oberleutnant Richter, who had never shown fear of anything except procedural irregularity, kept his eyes fixed on his desk and spoke only when directly addressed. The arrests began that afternoon. First, they took Stefan Kowalczyk, a radio operator who processed encrypted communications from field units. He was escorted out through the main corridor in handcuffs, his face blank with incomprehension. No charges announced, no explanation given. Just the sound of boots on marble and a door closing somewhere below ground level. Then Jadwiga Nowak, a filing clerk who had worked in the building for 11 years. She was dragged from her desk, screaming, insisting she had done nothing, knew nothing, understood nothing. Her voice echoed through the stairwell until it didn't. By May 10th, 4 more clerical staff had been detained. Rumors spread through whispered Polish conversations in bathroom stalls and stairwells, interrogations lasting hours, questions about resistance contacts, confessions extracted through methods no one wanted to name. A junior Wehrmacht officer named Lieutenant Hartmann, who had approved several of the disputed directives, was quietly transferred and later, according to corridor gossip, court-martialed and executed for negligence, resulting in operational compromise. Wieczorek watched it unfold from his desk by the window. He continued translating, carefully, correctly, with the same meticulous attention to detail that had always defined his work. But now each stroke of his pen felt heavier, weighted with knowledge that his precision was killing people who had never chosen to be weapons. The Gestapo officers passed his desk twice, 3 times, a dozen times. They glanced at him the way one might glance at a filing cabinet, acknowledgement without interest, because translators, in the German conception of administrative machinery, were mechanisms. You didn't interrogate a typewriter for producing subversive documents. You interrogated the person who had operated it. Language, he realized, was considered inherently neutral, a tool without agency. The Gestapo was searching for conspirators, for networks, for human intention and human malice. They arrested radio operators because radios could transmit secrets. They beat clerks because clerks had access to files. They executed officers because officers made decisions. But a translator? A translator simply converted words. He had no capacity for independent action, no opportunity for sabotage, no means to alter reality beyond rendering one language into another with appropriate fidelity to meaning. His correctness had become armor. His expertise had become camouflage. And every dictionary citation, every grammatical justification, every reference to linguistic precedent reinforced the illusion that he was nothing more than what he appeared to be, a competent linguist doing exactly what he had been ordered to do. But late at night, alone in his apartment, Wieczorek would sit at his desk and think about Stefan Kowalczyk's blank face as the handcuffs closed around his wrists, about Jadwiga Nowak's voice cutting off mid-scream, about Lieutenant Hartmann, who had probably signed his own death warrant simply by trusting that a translated document meant what it appeared to mean. He had known intellectually that consequences would follow, that confusion would metastasize into blame, that blame would demand targets. But knowing it abstractly and watching it unfold were different things entirely. These people were dying, not because they had resisted, but because someone had to be guilty, and he had made himself impossible to suspect. The moral weight of that calculus pressed against him like physical force. He had chosen this weapon precisely because it left no fingerprints, no evidence, no trail leading back to intention. He had engineered a perfect crime, and the punishment was falling on everyone except the criminal. On May 12th, a Gestapo officer appeared at his desk, not one of the interrogators, but an administrative liaison, older, thin-faced, carrying a leather portfolio. "Herr Wieczorek," he said, his Polish accented but functional, "you are summoned for consultation. Bring your reference materials. Not accused, not arrested, not even particularly suspected, just questioned." Wieczorek closed his dictionary, gathered his documentation, and stood. His hands did not shake. His expression remained neutral, and as he followed the officer toward the basement stairs, he understood with perfect clarity that the next 30 minutes would determine whether language could continue to protect him, or whether precision, interrogated closely enough, would finally reveal the weapon hidden inside. The basement room smelled of damp concrete and old paper. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across a wooden table where 3 men sat waiting. The administrative liaison who had summoned him, a Gestapo Hauptsturmführer with cold eyes and manicured hands, and Oberleutnant Richter, who would not meet Wieczorek's gaze. "Sit," the Hauptsturmführer said, gesturing to a chair facing the table. Wieczorek sat. He placed his reference materials, 2 dictionaries, a Wehrmacht terminology manual, and a folder of previous translations, on the table with practiced care. His hands remained steady. The Hauptsturmführer opened a file. "The directive of April 14th, the word bereinigen. You translated this as zlikwidować. Yes. Why? Because in tactical contexts involving area security operations, bereinigen carries connotations of comprehensive clearance. Zlikwidować represents the appropriate Polish equivalent for operations requiring. The Oberst did not intend comprehensive clearance. I translated the language, not the intention, Herr Hauptsturmführer. My responsibility is to render German military terminology into accurate Polish equivalents based on established doctrine and precedent." The Hauptsturmführer leaned forward. "But you chose zlikwidować specifically. You could have chosen zabezpieczyć, to secure." "I could have, but zabezpieczyć implies defensive posture, maintaining existing conditions. The directive referenced partisan activity and approach routes requiring action by Friday. In that context, bereinigen suggests active resolution, not passive security. Wieczorek reached for the Wehrmacht manual, opening it to a marked page. Section 4.7, subsection 3. Area Operations Terminology. Bereinigen is explicitly defined as removal of hostile or obstructive elements from operationally significant terrain. Zlikwidować is the standard Polish rendering. Oberleutnant Richter finally spoke, his voice tight. But the ambiguity caused operational confusion. Language contains inherent ambiguity, Herr Oberleutnant. German military doctrine relies on contextual interpretation by field commanders. If the directive lacked sufficient specificity, that is a matter of composition, not translation. Silence. The Hauptsturmführer exchanged glances with the administrative liaison. Other directives, the liaison said, consulting notes. May the 2nd. The term clarin. You translated this as restrict, rather than clarify. Both are valid. Clarin derives from klar, clear. In logistical contexts, to make clear can mean to define boundaries, which is functionally restrictive. The directive concerned supply routes. I selected the interpretation most consistent with operational security protocols. But it caused delays. It caused requests for clarification, which is standard procedure when subordinate commanders require additional specificity before execution. My translation was grammatically and terminologically correct. The Hauptsturmführer's jaw tightened. You are very precise, Herr Wieczorek. Precision is required in military translation, Herr Hauptsturmführer. Imprecision would be sabotage. The word hung in the air. Sabotage. And Wieczorek watched the Hauptsturmführer's expression shift through a rapid calculation. Because that was the trap, wasn't it? To accuse Wieczorek of sabotage through precision was to admit that German military language was structurally flawed, that its terminology permitted catastrophic misinterpretation, that the entire apparatus of documentation and protocol rested on linguistic ambiguities that could be exploited simply by following the rules correctly. They couldn't acknowledge that, not without dismantling the system itself. For 90 minutes they questioned him. They asked about other translations, other word choices, other moments where meaning might have slipped sideways. And for 90 minutes, Wieczorek answered with calm, methodical precision. He cited sources. He referenced precedents. He demonstrated with documentation spread across the table that every decision he had made existed within the boundaries of acceptable professional practice. He was not defensive. He was not apologetic. He was simply correct. And correctness in a system built on documentation was irrefutable. Finally, the Hauptsturmführer closed the file. His expression carried something Wieczorek had never seen directed at him before. Not suspicion, not anger, but a kind of frustrated unease. The look of a man who sensed damage but could not define its source, who knew something was wrong but possessed no language to articulate what. You may return to your duties, Herr Wieczorek. Wieczorek gathered his materials, stood, and walked toward the door. Behind him he heard the Hauptsturmführer mutter something to the liaison in German, too quiet to distinguish clearly. 3 days later, Oberleutnant Richter informed him, without looking up from his desk, that the investigation file had been marked Keine Maßnahme, unzureichende Beweise, no action, insufficient evidence. Language, once again, had protected him. Because the most devastating sabotage leaves no crime to prosecute, only consequences too perfectly aligned with the rules to be called violations. By June, the German occupation apparatus in Warsaw had transformed into something its architects would not have recognized, a bureaucracy paralyzed by its own language. Directives that had once been 3 sentences now stretched across multiple pages, dense with qualifiers, addendums, and clarifying sub-clauses. Officers who had previously issued commands with Prussian efficiency now spent hours drafting supplementary documentation, preemptively answering questions that might arise from ambiguous terminology. The word bereinigen disappeared entirely from official communications, replaced by longer, more explicit phrases that left no room for interpretation, and consequently, no room for initiative. Field commanders, burned by previous misunderstandings, began refusing to execute orders without written confirmation of their interpretation. Radio traffic increased exponentially as junior officers requested clarification on phrasing, terminology, and intent. Meetings that had once resolved operational questions in minutes now extended across entire afternoons, with participants debating not strategy, but semantics. Whether so forth meant immediately or urgently, whether sicherstellen implied guarantee or verification. The war in Warsaw, at least, had slowed to the pace of linguistic negotiation. Trust, which had been the invisible architecture holding the occupation together, evaporated. Officers stopped relying on verbal orders from superiors. Clerks stopped trusting that filed documents meant what they appeared to mean. Even Oberleutnant Richter, who had built his entire identity around procedural correctness, now second-guessed his own translations, checking and rechecking terminology until simple directives took hours to process. The system had become afraid of its own words, and Wieczorek, the man who had introduced that fear, found himself increasingly irrelevant. By late June, most directives were being drafted in both German and Polish simultaneously, with multiple translators cross-verifying each other's work. His workload diminished. His expertise, once indispensable, became just another layer in an ever-expanding verification process. On July 3rd, he was informed of his reassignment, transferred to a supply depot on the outskirts of the city where his linguistic skills would be used to process inventory documentation. It was not a promotion. It was not a demotion. It was simply displacement. The administrative machinery had found a way to function without him, albeit at a fraction of its former efficiency. He reported to the new posting for 2 weeks, translating requisition forms and shipping manifests in a converted warehouse that smelled of diesel and mildew. The work was mind-numbing, mechanical, devoid of strategic significance. No officers dictated orders. No couriers rushed documents to field commands. Just endless lists of supplies moving through a logistical system too compromised by paranoia to move them efficiently. By late July, even that assignment ended. The supply depot was consolidated with another facility. Wieczorek received a dismissal notice, typed in German, translated into Polish by someone else, thanking him for his service and informing him that his skills were no longer required by the occupation authority. He was free to go, free to disappear back into civilian life if such a thing still existed in Warsaw. The city, meanwhile, continued its slow collapse. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. The Polish underground was preparing for uprising. And the German command structure, which had once controlled Warsaw with mechanical precision, now found itself drowning in its own documentation, issuing orders that arrived late, executing strategies that required so much clarification they became obsolete before implementation, fighting a war where every directive had to be legally defensible and linguistically unambiguous. They had sacrificed speed for certainty. They had traded authority for accountability. And in doing so, they had lost the one advantage occupation requires: the ability to act decisively while the occupied population hesitates. Wieczorek returned to his small apartment and began packing his notebooks, years of translations, reference materials, dictionaries marked with careful annotations. He worked methodically, wrapping each volume in brown paper, stacking them in a wooden crate he would bury in his mother's cellar. No one would ever read these notebooks. No one would ever know what they contained. Not confessions, not manifestos, but simply the evidence of perfect translation. Word choices that had followed every rule while breaking an entire system from within. Outside his window, he could hear distant explosions. The front was moving closer. Warsaw was burning again, but this time the flames were approaching from the east, and the Germans were the ones preparing to flee. He closed the last notebook and placed it in the crate. His weapon had bought confusion, not victory, but confusion, in the end, had been enough. The question now was whether history would remember any of it, or whether his war, like his translations, would be filed away as routine administrative work. Footnotes in reports no one would ever read carefully enough to understand what had actually happened. The Germans left Warsaw in January 1945, not in orderly columns, but in desperate fragments, trucks overloaded with files, officers burning documents in oil drums, entire administrative departments evacuated in hours. The State Archive building, which had been the nerve center of occupation bureaucracy, was stripped bare. Desks overturned, filing cabinets emptied, maps torn from walls. Wieczorek watched from a doorway 3 blocks away as smoke rose from the building's courtyard. Years of directives, translations, and operational records reduced to ash. The Germans were erasing their own paper trail, destroying the evidence of how they had controlled the city. In doing so, they were also erasing him. He did not try to stop them. He simply turned and walked back to his apartment through streets cratered by artillery and lined with frozen bodies. Warsaw had become a necropolis, and he was just another ghost moving through its ruins. When Soviet forces arrived days later, Wieczorek was questioned briefly. Name, occupation, wartime activities. He answered truthfully. He had been a translator, pressed into service, dismissed months before the retreat. The Soviet officer made a note and moved on. There were thousands like him, civilians who had survived by being useful, then survived again by being forgettable. He resumed teaching after the war, returning to the university where he had once lectured on German legal texts. His students were different now, older, harder, marked by occupation, in ways that made medieval manuscripts seem impossibly distant. He taught them about language, about precision, about the responsibility of translation. He never mentioned what he had done. The official histories, when they were written, described the collapse of German control in Warsaw as a result of administrative inefficiencies, communication breakdowns, and operational misunderstandings. Reports cited the unusually high volume of directive clarifications in spring 1943, the slowdown of command decision-making, the erosion of trust between field units and headquarters. Analysts attributed these failures to the stress of partisan resistance, overextension of supply lines, and declining morale. No documents mentioned a translator. No investigation ever identified the pattern. Because the pattern was invisible, hidden inside grammatically correct translations that had followed every rule while engineering catastrophic ambiguity. Wieczorek lived another 32 years. He never wrote a memoir, never gave testimony, never claimed recognition for what he had done, because claiming it would have required explaining it, and explaining it would have revealed the terrible simplicity of his method. that institutional power, however brutal, however absolute, still depended on language, and language could be bent. He died in 1977 in a small apartment filled with books, his notebooks still buried in a cellar where his mother's house had once stood. The obituary in the university newsletter described him as a dedicated scholar of Germanic philology who had contributed significantly to post-war linguistic studies. No mention of the war, no acknowledgement of sabotage, just the quiet erasure that settles over ordinary lives when history moves on. But somewhere in the archives, Soviet, Polish, West German, there exist reports that researchers still puzzle over. Directives from spring 1943 that show unusual patterns of clarification requests. Operational logs documenting unexplained delays. Testimony from German officers describing a period when the language itself seemed to fail us, when orders stopped meaning what they were intended to mean. The researchers categorize these as communication failures, translation errors, the inevitable friction of occupation bureaucracy. They never consider that the failures might have been deliberate, that someone might have weaponized precision itself. And perhaps that's the final irony. Wicherek's weapon was so perfectly camouflaged that even 70 years later, history cannot see it. The image that defined Warsaw's occupation, German soldiers outside, guns raised, authority absolute, captured only half the story. It never showed the man inside, pen in hand, quietly rewriting their commands into chaos. Monuments commemorate the resistance fighters who died with weapons in their hands. Streets bear the names of partisans who fell in open combat. But no memorial exists for the translator who survived, because survival through invisibility leaves nothing to memorialize except the consequences. Power fell in Warsaw not because someone shouted, not because someone fired, but because someone chose the wrong word at exactly the right moment. And the system, trusting language absolutely, executed its own dismantling without ever understanding what had gone wrong. The occupation collapsed, the translator disappeared, and language, as it always does, outlasted them both. Stanisław Wieczorek's story teaches us something crucial. Power doesn't always fall to the loudest voice or the strongest force. Sometimes it falls to the person who understands the system well enough to use its own rules against it. Language isn't just communication, it's architecture. And architecture has weak points. If you want more stories like this, forgotten acts of resistance, invisible heroes who changed history without firing a shot, and the strategic brilliance hidden in moments that seem ordinary, hit that subscribe button right now. We dig through archives, declassified documents, and buried testimonies to bring you the stories that didn't make it into textbooks, but absolutely should have. And if this story of linguistic warfare fascinated you, click the video on your screen right now for an even more intense tale of deception, survival, and one person's refusal to let tyranny win. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.